Close your eyes for a moment and ask yourself this simple question: what do I truly want in this life? For most of us, the answer is not wealth, not fame, not even success. Deep down, what we really seek is happiness. That gentle peace of mind, that lasting sense of contentment, that quiet smile in the heart that says, I am at ease, I am whole. But here's the paradox. We all want happiness, yet so few of us ever feel we've truly found it. We run, we chase, we try to grasp it through achievements, relationships, possessions, but it slips through our fingers like sand. Why is that? Why does something so universal, so natural, seem so elusive? Think about it. Children, adults, the elderly, no matter the culture or the place, all living beings are driven by this same longing. A bird building its nest, a child reaching for candy, a young man chasing career dreams, or an old woman praying at a temple, they are all seeking some form of happiness. Yet, despite the countless ways we search, we often end up feeling empty, restless, unsatisfied. The Buddha once observed this very dilemma. He pointed out that our suffering is not simply because life is difficult, but because we are looking for happiness in the wrong places. We confuse fleeting pleasure with lasting peace. Pleasure is like a spark. It flares bright for a moment but quickly fades. True happiness, however, is like a steady flame that warms us from within. Pause and reflect. How many times have you told yourself, if I just get this one thing, then I'll be happy? Maybe it was a new job, a relationship, a house, or even just the latest phone. And yes, for a while, it felt good. But soon enough, that satisfaction wore off, and your mind reached for the next desire, the next milestone. The cycle never ends. This is the never-ending chase the Buddha spoke of, a pursuit that exhausts us because it is directed outward. We keep knocking on doors that cannot give us what we seek. And when the happiness doesn't arrive, frustration sets in. Yet here lies the good news. True happiness can be found, but not in the way we've been taught by society. The secret does not lie in changing the world around us, but in transforming the world within us. Happiness is not hidden in some distant future. It is already present, waiting quietly in the purity of our own minds. The Buddha captured this beautifully in the opening verses of the Dhammapada. He taught, if a man speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows him, but if he speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows him like a shadow that never leaves. In other words, happiness and sorrow are not accidents of fate, they are the fruits of our own minds. So let me ask you again, if happiness is what you've always wanted, are you ready to stop searching outside and start discovering it within yourself? This journey we are about to take together is not about abandoning life or rejecting the world. It is about seeing more clearly, living more wisely, and unlocking the joy that is already here. In the chapters ahead, we will explore timeless Buddhist wisdom and practical steps, acceptance, generosity, forgiveness, mindfulness, that can turn the restless chase into a peaceful arrival. Imagine for a moment what life would feel like if you could carry happiness with you, no matter where you are, no matter what happens around you. Imagine a mind so free, so pure, that no storm can shake its calm. This is not a fantasy, it is the very path the Buddha laid out. And it begins now with the willingness to look inward. So stay with me. Listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. Together, let us walk into the wisdom of Zen Buddhism and uncover the art of living a truly happy life. We ended with a question: if happiness is what we've always wanted, why do we keep missing it? The truth is simple, yet profound. We fail to find happiness because most of us are searching in places where it does not exist. Think about the way modern life trains us. From childhood, we are told that happiness will come after certain milestones. Study hard, get good grades, find a good job, build a family, buy a house, travel, retire comfortably. Each step promises the same thing. Once you reach here, you will be happy. And yet, when we arrive, the feeling is never quite enough. The moment of joy fades, replaced by new desires, new worries, new comparisons. It is like chasing the horizon. No matter how far you walk, it never comes closer. Why? Because the horizon was never something you could reach, it was only an illusion created by your perspective. In the same way, we project happiness onto things outside ourselves, not realizing that it is our mind, not the object, that creates the experience. The Buddha taught that this restless pursuit is fueled by three poisons: desire, aversion, and ignorance. Desire makes us believe, if I get this, then I'll be happy. Aversion whispers, if I can just avoid this pain, I'll finally be at peace. Ignorance blinds us to the truth that neither gaining nor avoiding brings lasting fulfillment. Take desire, for example. Imagine buying a brand new car. The first few weeks you feel proud, excited, joyful, but slowly the shine fades. You get used to it. Then a friend buys a newer model and suddenly your happiness turns sour. You start craving again, reaching for the next upgrade. This is the trap of desire. It never ends. Now think about aversion. Maybe you've been through heartbreak, failure, or loss. Your mind tells you, if only this had not happened, I could be happy. But suffering arises not simply because pain exists. It is because we resist it, push it away, and fight against reality. The more we resist, the more the pain grows. And then there is ignorance, the greatest trap of all. It is the belief that external things can provide permanent happiness. We ignore the truth of impermanence. Everything changes: wealth, health, relationships, beauty, success. When we cling to what cannot last, disappointment is guaranteed. The Buddha compared this to drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. In the same way, chasing pleasure only deepens the craving. It gives us momentary relief, but never the lasting peace we long for. But let's bring this closer to everyday life. Picture a young professional who works tirelessly, believing that once she earns a promotion, she'll finally be happy. She sacrifices her health, her sleep, her relationships, and after years of effort, the promotion arrives. For a brief time, she celebrates. But soon, new pressures come: higher responsibilities, greater stress, longer hours. She realizes the happiness she was chasing was never in the title, but in the state of mind she neglected. Or consider a man in his old age, looking back on decades spent accumulating wealth. He has houses, cars, luxuries, but his heart feels empty. Why? Because in chasing material success, he never cultivated inner peace, compassion, or gratitude. His possessions bring comfort, but not joy. We fail to find happiness not because happiness does not exist, but because we are looking in the wrong direction. We search outside while the source has always been inside. The Buddha summarized this in the Dhammapada. The mind is the forerunner of all states. If with an impure mind one speaks or acts, suffering follows. If with a pure mind one speaks or acts, happiness follows like a shadow. This is why we don't find it, because we haven't trained the mind, the very instrument that generates happiness. Modern psychology echoes this truth. Studies show that people quickly adapt to external changes, a concept called the hedonic treadmill. Win the lottery or suffer a setback, within months most people return to their baseline level of happiness. Why? Because circumstances shift, but the mind's habits remain the same. Without inner transformation, outer gains are fleeting. So if you've ever wondered, why am I not happy, even though I have so much? Or why does happiness slip away every time I reach a goal? Now you know, it is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. The key lies not in adding more, but in learning to purify and calm the mind. And here is the liberating truth. The moment we stop seeking happiness from what cannot give it, we open the door to discovering what can. The path does not ask us to abandon life, but to live it differently, to see reality as it is, to accept its impermanence, and to cultivate qualities that naturally give rise to joy. The question now becomes, if happiness is not found in chasing desires, resisting pain, or clinging to illusions, then where can it be found? That is where our journey continues. Up to this point, we've seen why our pursuit of happiness often fails. We chase, we resist, we cling, and yet the joy we long for keeps slipping away. But the Buddha did not leave us lost in confusion. He gave us a compass, a clear insight into where real happiness begins. And some of his most powerful words are found in the Dhammapada, the timeless collection of his teachings. The opening verses are like a mirror held up to our lives. The Buddha said, "If with an impure mind a person speaks or acts, suffering follows him, as the wheel of the cart follows the ox that pulls it. If with a pure mind a person speaks or acts, happiness follows him, like a shadow that never leaves." Pause for a moment and let that sink in. The Buddha is telling us that happiness and suffering are not accidents. They are not random gifts handed out by destiny. They are natural consequences of the state of our mind. Think about it. How often do we blame our unhappiness on outside conditions? We say, if only my boss respected me more, if only my partner understood me, if only I had more money, more time, better health. But the Buddha shifts the focus. He says, look inside. Your happiness does not depend on the outer world. It depends on the purity of your mind. Let me share a story to illustrate this. There was once a poor farmer who lived in a small village. He owned a single ox that pulled his cart to the market. One day, the ox fell ill and died. The farmer was devastated. He sat on the ground, crying, convinced that his life was ruined. A wise monk happened to pass by and asked him, "Why are you so unhappy?" The farmer replied, "My ox is gone. Without it, I cannot bring goods to the market. My life is over." The monk said gently, "Yes, the ox is gone. But tell me, do you still have two hands to work with? Do you still have neighbors who care for you? Do you still have the earth beneath your feet and the sky above your head?" The farmer paused. He realized that while he had lost one thing, he still had countless blessings left. His suffering was not caused by the loss itself, but by the impurity of his mind. His clinging, his despair, his refusal to see the bigger picture. This is exactly what the Dhammapada points to. Suffering follows an impure mind like a heavy cart stuck in the mud. But happiness follows a pure mind as effortlessly as a shadow that never leaves your side. Now, what does it mean to have a pure mind? It does not mean a mind free of all thoughts or emotions. It means a mind that is free from greed, hatred, and delusion. A mind that is calm, compassionate, and wise. Imagine two people stuck in the same traffic jam. One grips the steering wheel, cursing every car in front of him, boiling with frustration. The other takes a deep breath, turns on some gentle music, and uses the time to reflect quietly. Same situation, yet one is in hell, the other is at peace. The difference is not the traffic. The difference is the mind. This is the Buddha's key insight. Happiness is not what happens to you, but how you meet what happens. It is not a reward to be earned someday. It is a shadow that follows you the moment your mind is pure. But here's the challenge. Our minds are rarely pure. They are clouded by habits, by old wounds, by endless desires. The Dhammapada reminds us that the work of life is not to control every circumstance, but to cleanse and train the mind itself. Think of it like polishing a mirror. At first, the surface is covered with dust. You wipe, and slowly the shine emerges. The mirror did not need to be created, it was always there. In the same way, happiness is not something we need to invent. It is already present in the mind. We only need to remove the dust of greed, anger, and ignorance to see it clearly. This is why Buddhist practice emphasizes mindfulness, meditation, and ethical living. Each practice is a way of purifying the mind, of aligning our speech and actions with wisdom and compassion. As the Buddha said, when your mind is pure, happiness follows naturally. You don't have to chase it. It becomes your constant companion, like a faithful shadow. And so the great shift begins. Instead of blaming the world for our suffering, we take responsibility for our own mind. Instead of waiting for happiness to arrive, we cultivate it right here, right now. But this raises an important question. If happiness flows from a pure mind, how exactly do we purify it? What steps can we take in everyday life to move closer to this state of lasting peace? That is where our journey now leads us. If the Buddha's words in the Dhammapada show us that happiness begins with the purity of our mind, then one of the first steps toward that purity is acceptance, the courage to face life exactly as it is. Life is not a smooth line. It rises and falls, shifts and bends, surprises us with beauty, and sometimes wounds us with pain. We want it to be predictable, but reality has its own rhythm. The seasons change, our bodies age, loved ones come and go, fortunes rise and fall. And yet, so much of our suffering comes not from these changes themselves, but from our resistance to them. Think about it. How often have you told yourself, "This should not be happening. This isn't fair. Why me?" Those words tighten the mind like chains around the heart. The pain is real, but our refusal to accept reality multiplies that pain into suffering. The Buddha taught, in life, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. What does that mean? It means pain is part of being alive. You will lose, you will fall ill, you will face setbacks. But suffering is what happens when we add resistance, anger, or denial on top of that pain. Let me share a story. There was once a woman named Kisa Gautami in the time of the Buddha. She was a young mother whose only child suddenly died. Broken with grief, she carried the tiny body to the Buddha and begged him, "Please, Master, give me medicine to bring my son back to life." The Buddha did not reject her. Instead, he said, "Go into the village and bring me a mustard seed from any household that has never known death." With hope burning in her heart, she ran from house to house. At each door she asked, "Has anyone here ever lost a loved one?" And at every door the answer was the same, "Yes." my mother, my father, my brother, my child. By the time she returned to the Buddha, she was no longer begging for medicine. She had seen with her own eyes that death is part of every family, every life. She bowed and said, "Now I understand. My grief is not mine alone." This is the power of acceptance. It does not erase the pain, but it transforms the mind. It allows us to meet life as it is, not as we wish it to be. In our modern world, we face challenges that look different but carry the same lesson. Maybe you've lost a job. Maybe your relationship ended. Maybe a dream you held for years did not come true. The question is, will you spend your days saying, "This should not have happened"? Or will you say, "Yes, this has happened. What can I learn? How can I grow? What door will open now?" Acceptance is not weakness. It is not giving up. In fact, it is the foundation of strength. Because when you accept reality, you are no longer wasting energy fighting against the unchangeable. You free that energy to take wise, compassionate action. Picture a river. If you stand in it and push against the current, you exhaust yourself. But if you learn to float, to let the water carry you, you discover a hidden strength, you move forward with less effort, guided by the natural flow. So ask yourself, what part of your life are you still resisting? What past event do you replay over and over, wishing it had gone differently? The moment you accept, yes, it happened. Yes, it hurt. But it is not the end of me. That is the moment your mind begins to purify and happiness begins to follow like a shadow. Acceptance doesn't mean we like everything. It means we face everything with clarity. And when we do, even suffering can become a teacher, guiding us deeper into wisdom. And once we see life clearly, we begin to discover another truth the Buddha emphasized. Happiness grows not only from acceptance, but also from what we give away. Generosity, or Dāna, is the next key. When we learn to accept life as it is, something beautiful begins to happen inside us. Our grip loosens. We no longer cling so tightly to control, to possessions, to expectations. And in that space of openness, generosity naturally blooms. In Buddhism, generosity is called Dāna. It is considered the very first perfection, the starting point on the path to liberation. Why? Because when we give, we free ourselves from the illusion that clinging will bring us happiness. Think about it. Most of us are taught from childhood that the more we gather, the more secure we'll feel. More money, more property, more recognition, more success. And yes, those things can bring comfort, but they don't bring the deep happiness the heart longs for. In fact, clinging to them often creates anxiety, the fear of losing what we have, or the endless craving for more. Generosity flips this logic upside down. Instead of asking, "What can I get?" it asks, "What can I give?" And in that shift, something miraculous happens. The heart feels light. There's a story told in the Buddhist tradition. A wealthy merchant once approached the Buddha and asked, "Master, I have everything: gold, land, servants, influence, yet I feel restless and dissatisfied. What should I do?" The Buddha replied, "Wealth is not meant to be hoarded. It is meant to flow. Just as water grows foul when it is trapped in a pond, but remains pure when it flows in a river, so too wealth becomes wholesome when it circulates through acts of generosity." The merchant took these words to heart. He began using his wealth to build wells for villages, to provide food for the hungry, to support the monks and nuns on their path. And in time, he discovered a joy deeper than any pleasure money had ever brought him, the joy of seeing others flourish because of his generosity. Now, you may be thinking, "But I'm not a wealthy merchant. What do I have to give?" The truth is, generosity is not measured by size, but by spirit. A kind word, a listening ear, a smile offered to a stranger, these can be as powerful as gold when given with sincerity. Modern science even echoes this. Studies show that people who volunteer their time, who practice kindness, who give to others, consistently report higher levels of happiness and lower levels of stress. Why? Because generosity awakens our natural capacity for connection. It reminds us that life is not a competition, but a shared journey. Let's bring this closer to everyday life. Imagine you see someone struggling with heavy bags at the grocery store. You step in, carry a bag for them, and they smile with relief. That small moment, though it cost you nothing, leaves you with a glow that lingers. Or imagine you donate a meal to someone who hasn't eaten all day. Long after they are full, the memory of their gratitude continues to feed your heart. Generosity also heals us in unexpected ways. When we are trapped in our own problems, our stress, our worries, our disappointments, our world shrinks. But the moment we give to someone else, the walls of self-concern begin to dissolve. We remember that life is bigger than our own struggles, and that realization itself is liberating. The Buddha even said that the joy of giving lasts far longer than the joy of receiving. When you buy yourself a new outfit or gadget, the excitement fades quickly. But when you remember an act of kindness you offered years ago, perhaps food given to a hungry child or words that comforted a grieving friend, the happiness is still alive in you today. This is why Dāna is more than charity. It is a practice, a way of shaping the mind. Every time you give freely, without expectation, you polish away a little of greed's dust. You purify your heart. And as the Dhammapada reminded us, happiness follows a pure mind like a shadow that never leaves. So the next time you feel stuck, heavy, or unhappy, ask yourself, what can I give right now? It doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be sincere. And as we deepen this practice of generosity, another question arises. How do we deal with the hurts and mistakes of the past, the ones that weigh down our hearts, keeping us from giving fully? The answer lies in the next step toward true happiness, the practice of forgiveness. Generosity opens the heart, but sometimes that heart is still heavy with old wounds, grudges, and regrets. We give, but deep inside, we may still carry the shadows of anger, betrayal, or guilt. That's why forgiveness is not just a nice idea, it is a doorway to freedom. Forgiveness in Buddhism is not about pretending that harm never happened. It is not about saying, it's okay when it wasn't. Rather, forgiveness is about releasing the burden that pain has placed on your heart. Because the truth is, when we hold on to anger, we are the ones who suffer most. The Buddha once said, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. Think about that for a moment. How many of us are carrying these hot coals? The insult we never forgot, the betrayal we replay in our minds, the mistake we keep punishing ourselves for. Each memory is like a coal, burning us every time we clutch it. And yet, we refuse to let it go, thinking somehow, holding on will bring justice. But what it really brings is suffering. There's a powerful story from the life of the Buddha. Two monks were traveling together and came across a woman who needed to cross a river. One monk lifted her up and carried her across. Hours later, after they had walked many miles, the other monk said bitterly, "Why did you carry that woman? We monks are not supposed to touch women." The first monk smiled and replied, "Brother, I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" That's the essence of forgiveness, learning to set down what no longer needs to be carried. But forgiveness is not only for others, it is also for ourselves. Many people walk through life with deep shame or regret. Maybe it was a choice they made years ago. Maybe it was words spoken in anger. Whatever the reason, they keep punishing themselves as if suffering today could change the past. Yet the Buddha reminds us that every moment is new. As long as we are alive, we have the chance to begin again. Self-forgiveness is the courage to stop replaying the old tape and to say, yes, I made mistakes, but I will not let them define me. I will use them to grow. Forgiveness also has a surprising power. It makes space for compassion. When we let go of resentment, we start to see that everyone, even those who hurt us, is struggling with their own pain, ignorance, and fears. This doesn't mean we condone harmful actions. It simply means we no longer chain ourselves to them. Think of it like a heavy backpack. Each grudge is a rock inside it. The longer you carry it, the more exhausted you become. Forgiveness is taking those rocks out, one by one, until you can finally walk freely again. And science confirms what the Buddha taught centuries ago. People who forgive have lower blood pressure, less anxiety, and stronger immune systems. Their relationships are healthier, their lives lighter. It's as if the body itself knows the weight of resentment and longs to be free. So, how do we practice forgiveness? It begins with intention. You don't have to feel ready to forgive right away. You simply have to be willing to try. You might sit quietly and repeat, I forgive you not because what you did was okay, but because I deserve peace. Or, I forgive myself. I am human, I will begin again. With time, those words soften the heart. What once felt impossible slowly becomes possible. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is strength. It takes far more courage to let go than to cling, and in that release, you rediscover a freedom that no one can take away from you. When generosity and forgiveness come together, the heart is both open and unburdened. And from that state of clarity, we are ready to explore the ultimate goal of Buddhism, the happiness that never fades, known as Nirvana. Forgiveness frees us, generosity opens us, and acceptance grounds us. But freedom and happiness are not accidents, they are cultivated step by step, day by day. Just as a garden only thrives when tended, the mind only blossoms when nourished by daily practice. The Buddha often compared the mind to a field. If we neglect it, weeds of anger, craving, and confusion grow wild. But if we plant seeds of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom, the harvest is joy. And the best way to ensure this harvest is through small, steady practices woven into daily life. So, what does this look like? It begins with mindfulness. Just 5 minutes in the morning can change the tone of your entire day. Instead of reaching for your phone, try sitting quietly. Feel your breath. Notice the rising and falling of your chest. When thoughts come, let them pass like clouds across the sky. This simple act anchors you in the present. Another practice is gratitude. Each evening, pause and recall 3 things you are grateful for. They don't have to be grand. It could be the laughter of a friend, the taste of a warm meal, or even the fact that you made it through a difficult day. Gratitude shifts the mind from what is missing to what is already abundant. Then there is loving-kindness meditation, known as metta. You sit quietly and silently repeat, "May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease." Then extend it to others. May you be happy. May you be healthy. At first, it may feel awkward. But over time, it melts the walls of isolation and fills the heart with warmth. Daily practice also means living with right intention in small actions. For example, before speaking, pause and ask, will my words bring harm or will they bring peace? Before eating, take a moment to reflect. May this food give me strength to live wisely and kindly. In this way, even ordinary acts, eating, walking, working, become spiritual practice. Let me share a story. A student once asked a Zen master, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The student was confused. "Isn't that what everyone does?" The master smiled, "Not quite. When others eat, their minds are elsewhere. When they sleep, they are tangled in dreams. I eat with full awareness. I sleep with full rest." That is daily practice, bringing presence to what we already do, transforming the mundane into the sacred. Even science now supports this. Studies show that daily mindfulness practices reduce stress, improve focus, and even strengthen the immune system. Gratitude rewires the brain toward positivity. Acts of kindness release oxytocin, the love hormone, making us feel more connected. In other words, what the Buddha taught 500 years ago is confirmed today. Daily practice reshapes both the mind and the body. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: it's not about perfection. Some days your mind will wander. Some days you'll forget to pause. That's okay. The power lies not in never falling, but in returning again and again to the path. Think of it like watering a plant. One drop may not seem to matter, but day after day, those drops bring life. In the same way, each small act of mindfulness, each breath, each moment of kindness nourishes your spirit until happiness is no longer something you chase. It becomes who you are. And as this daily discipline deepens, another realization emerges. Life is not separate pieces, it is all connected. Your inner peace touches others. Their joy touches you. Which brings us to one of the most profound insights of Buddhism, the wisdom of interconnection. As we nurture mindfulness, generosity, and forgiveness day by day, we begin to notice something extraordinary. Our usual cravings and anxieties loosen their grip. Life feels lighter. But Buddhism reminds us this is just the beginning. Beyond the fleeting joys of daily practice lies a happiness so profound that words can barely describe it. The Buddha called it Nibbāna, the ultimate freedom. What is Nibbāna? At its heart, it is the extinguishing of the fires that torment the mind, craving, aversion, and delusion. These are the flames that keep us restless, always chasing, always resisting, always confused. Nibbāna is not some faraway heaven, nor is it the absence of life. It is the cooling of those fires. It is peace so complete, it needs nothing to sustain it. Think about the happiness most of us know. It depends on conditions. The right job, the right partner, the right possessions. And because conditions change, that happiness is fragile. But Nibbāna is happiness that does not rely on conditions. It is unshakable because it is rooted in wisdom, not circumstance. There's a story from the Buddha's time. A wanderer once asked him, What do you gain from your practice? What reward is there in renunciation? The Buddha replied, I gain nothing, but I lose anger, I lose craving, I lose delusion. This is the paradox of Nibbāna. It is not about gaining more but shedding what binds us. It is subtraction, not addition. And in that letting go, we discover the fullness we've been seeking all along. Some may wonder, is Nibbāna even possible for me, an ordinary person? The Buddha's answer was clear. Yes. Enlightenment is not reserved for saints or monks alone. Anyone who sincerely cultivates wisdom and compassion, anyone who learns to let go, can taste it, even if only in glimpses. Think of it like this. Every time you release anger instead of feeding it, you taste a drop of Nibbāna. Every time you resist craving and rest content with what you have, you taste it again. Every moment of clarity, where the fog of delusion lifts and you see life as it truly is, you touch that timeless freedom. In modern terms, we might compare it to finally putting down a heavy backpack you've been carrying for years. At first, you didn't even realize how heavy it was because you'd grown so used to it. But once it's gone, you feel an indescribable relief, a lightness that floods your whole being. And here lies the beauty. Nibbāna is not an escape from life, it is the deepest embrace of life. When the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion are quenched, what remains is pure awareness, boundless compassion, and effortless joy. The Buddha described Nibbāna as the highest bliss. Not because it is thrilling or ecstatic, but because it is beyond the reach of suffering. It is the stillness of a clear lake, the calm after a storm, the silence that holds all sound. And yet, this teaching is not meant to be abstract. The Buddha urged his disciples to walk the path step by step, to practice here and now. Nibbāna is not somewhere else, waiting after death. It can be glimpsed in this very breath, in this very moment when the mind is free. Imagine if, even for a few minutes a day, you could rest in that space, a mind untroubled, a heart unshaken. That is the direction all our practices point to. Acceptance prepares the ground, generosity opens the flow, forgiveness releases the weight, mindfulness steadies the mind. And together, they guide us toward the highest happiness. As we reflect on this, another question naturally arises. How do we keep moving toward this freedom in the midst of daily struggles, responsibilities, and challenges? The answer lies in living the Buddhist path not as theory, but as a lifestyle, allowing every action, every choice to become part of the journey. The promise of Nibbāna may sound lofty, timeless, even otherworldly. But the Buddha never taught a philosophy meant to be locked away in monasteries or reserved for saints. His teaching was always about life, real, ordinary life with all its noise, demands, and messiness. And if his wisdom cannot be applied to the world we live in now, with smartphones buzzing, cities rushing, and work piling up, then what good is it? The beauty is, it can. In fact, it must. So how do we bring Buddhism into modern life? It begins with awareness in daily routines. Most of us wake up and immediately check our phones, already pulled into a flood of news, emails, and notifications. What if instead you began each morning with just 3 mindful breaths? Just 3. A simple pause before you open the door to the world. That small act changes the entire rhythm of your day. It says, I will lead my mind, not let the world drag it. Next comes the workplace. In today's economy, stress is nearly universal. Deadlines, competition, endless meetings. Buddhism teaches us to reframe work not as a battlefield, but as a practice ground. Every time a coworker frustrates you, that's a chance to practice patience. Every time a project overwhelms you, that's a chance to practice mindfulness, breaking the task into small, present steps. When you remember to breathe before answering an email, you bring wisdom into the corporate world. Family life, too, offers endless opportunities. Children test our patience. Partners challenge our egos. But instead of seeing conflict as failure, Buddhism invites us to see it as training. The home becomes a monastery, not of silence, but of love. When you listen deeply to your child's fears, when you respond gently instead of harshly, you're living the Dharma in its purest form. And what about technology? Many fear that smartphones and social media are distractions pulling us away from presence. And yes, they can be. But Buddhism doesn't tell us to run away from the world. It asks us to relate wisely to it. That means using technology with intention. Instead of scrolling mindlessly, what if you used your phone to set a reminder to pause and breathe? What if you transformed your social media into a place to share compassion rather than comparison? The tool is not the problem, it's how we use it. Modern society also struggles with consumerism. We're told happiness lies in bigger houses, faster cars, and the latest gadgets. Yet Buddhism gently reminds us, happiness doesn't come from having more, but from needing less. Minimalism, now a popular lifestyle trend, echoes this ancient truth. When we simplify, when we declutter both our homes and our minds, we make space for what truly matters: peace, relationships, inner freedom. Here's a story to illustrate. A young professional once visited a Zen master, complaining of exhaustion. "I work all day, I barely sleep. I have no time for peace." The master handed him a teacup and began to pour. He poured until the tea spilled over, flooding the table. The man shouted, "Stop, it's overflowing." The master smiled. "Like this cup, your life is too full. You must empty it first before it can hold peace." That's the challenge of modern life. We keep pouring, piling, adding. But Buddhism offers us a radical alternative. Pause, empty, breathe. Peace isn't found in adding more, but in letting go. Even science now supports what Buddhism has long taught. Mindfulness practices are being used in hospitals to treat anxiety, in schools to help children focus, and in prisons to heal anger. Companies like Google and Apple teach meditation to employees, not as religion, but as a way to improve clarity and creativity. These are not ancient myths. They are living truths, still relevant today. But perhaps the greatest application of Buddhism in modern life is this: remembering that we are not separate. The Buddha's insight into interconnection feels more urgent than ever in a world facing climate change, war, and inequality. Each action we take ripples outward. Choosing compassion in a small interaction is not trivial, it is revolutionary. It shifts the fabric of society, one breath, one choice at a time. And so, applying Buddhism in modern life does not mean retreating from the world. It means living fully in the world, but with a different lens. Seeing each challenge as practice. Seeing each person as a teacher. Seeing each moment as sacred. This brings us to the natural close of our journey, a return to where we began, the universal search for happiness. Except now, we are no longer seekers chasing outside. We are cultivators, building happiness from within, rooted in wisdom, flowing out into the world. We began this journey by asking a simple question: what does every human being truly seek? The answer, whispered in every heart, was the same: happiness. But along the way, we discovered why so many fail to find it. We chase it in possessions, in praise, in fleeting pleasures, only to be left restless once again. The Buddha's wisdom turns our search inside out. He reminds us that true happiness cannot be bought, borrowed, or stolen. It arises from the purity of the mind, from the way we live, and from the choices we make each day. We learned that acceptance helps us meet life's ups and downs with balance, that generosity expands our hearts beyond selfish craving, and that forgiveness frees us from the chains of resentment. We discovered that daily practices, mindfulness, gratitude, compassion, are not just rituals, but nourishment for the soul. And then, we touched the most profound truth of all, that beyond the shifting tides of ordinary happiness lies Nibbāna, the ultimate peace. A happiness unshaken by gain or loss, beyond pleasure and pain, beyond the rise and fall of life itself. But perhaps most importantly, we saw how this teaching is not meant for monks in distant mountains alone. It is alive here in modern life, at work, at home, online, in every interaction we have. The Dharma is not separate from our world. It is the lens that transforms our world. So what then is the path to lasting happiness? It is not a secret nor a distant dream. It is the path we walk with every mindful step. It is the kindness we show in moments no one notices. It is the courage to let go when every instinct says to hold on. It is the willingness to look within again and again and purify the mind. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." These words are as true now as they were 500 years ago. As you leave this reflection, remember, you don't need to wait for the perfect day or the perfect life to begin. Happiness begins right where you are, with the breath you're taking now, with the choice you make in this moment. And if you continue, step by step, cultivating presence, compassion, and wisdom, then you will not just live a happy life, you will live a truly awakened one. So, may you walk this path with courage. May you embrace each moment with gratitude. And may your journey lead you always toward the freedom of lasting happiness. If these words touched your heart, let this not be the end of our journey together. Here on Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we continue to share reflections that help you live with more peace, clarity, and joy. If this teaching resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so these reminders of wisdom can find you when you need them most. Share this video with someone you love so they too may find light on their path. And as always, may you walk gently, breathe deeply, and live fully, right here, right now.